From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
No clear path in sight for Republicans in the House of Representatives as Congressman Jim Jordan emerges as the new GOP nominee for Speaker after another round of voting, but still far from winning a majority of the House. And members are now leaving for the weekend. We'll talk with Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan.
Plus, the war between Israel and Hamas entering its 8th day as Palestinians in North Gaza flee to the south. Israel giving residents 24 hours to leave the area ahead of an expected ground invasion.
We'll discuss that evacuation and the state of the war with former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Cohen. All that coming up this hour, Kaylee, on another breaking news day here in Washington as we try to follow the ball on this speaker's battle. More drama as Republicans get back behind closed doors today. And a new nominee emerges after Steve Scalise bowed out. That, of course, would be Jim Jordan.
The chair of the Judiciary Committee, a conservative firebrand in many aspects, and one, Joe, who is going to have his work cut out for him in trying to whip enough votes to actually get the speaker's gavel. The second vote happening behind closed doors. There was 55 Republicans who said they would not vote for him on the floor. And now everybody's going home for the weekend, which might leave at least Texas Republican Roger Williams a little disappointed, because he is ready to get this thing over with. Here's him earlier today.
We are ready, okay? I'm ready. We've been doing this too long. The process has worked its way through. We need to get a speaker. We need to get on about our business. So I think everybody's pretty agreeable. Let's do it as quick as we can and get it done.
Let's go to Capitol Hill right now. Spend some time with Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan. Congressman, thanks for the time. I know you're just emerging from this meeting and nomination vote. It looks like Congressman Jim Jordan has a way to go here. Are you doing the right thing by leaving Washington at this moment with this still not solved?
Yeah, I agree with my colleague Roger Williams. I wish we weren't, but I also am a realist and understand the basic facts, which are Jim Jordan has some work he's got to do. He's got to get in front of those people who are objecting about it. Personally, I had put in an amendment to our conference rules that would have required us to reach 217 before we go to the floor. That is sort of maybe the spirit of this in many ways. That isn't a formal rule, but guess what? We're not going to have any help from the Democrats. And not that we were necessarily expecting any, but we have got to come together as the Republicans to find 217 votes. Just like Steve Scalise, he did not have 217. Jim Jordan, though, needs to have the opportunity to try to get to that 217 threshold. It's interesting. I guess we're calling him Speaker Emeritus now. Kevin McCarthy spoke to the conference and said, we need to take the weekend. Jim needs to have this opportunity. We come back on Monday, and whether we then either whether it's late Monday, they haven't really announced this yet, whether it's on Monday or whether it's on Tuesday, we're going to start votes on the floor. But that really is when you're the speaker designee, you have a little more control of that timing, but he needs some time.
Well, to that point, Congressman, you just called yourself a realist. This isn't just a handful of minds he has to change here. It's more than 50. Yep. Do you really think he can get it done?
Don't know. He thinks he can. I had just talked to him a little while ago. I will note that's actually a smaller gulf than what Steve Scalise had initially. We don't know really what Steve's final number was because we didn't take this kind of affirmation vote or this test vote. So we'll find out. I can tell you this, that if it's not going to be Jim, we're going to need to move quickly, and I think you will see it somebody outside of the sort of the normal thought process of leadership, because I think my colleagues and I, we're done. We're very frustrated, but there's so many pinched fingers around here, so many people that can't get over themselves. It's very, very frustrating.
Yeah, you said earlier on Newsmax ahead of that vote, Congressman, if Jordan's not able to do that, and by that you meant reach 217, we're starting off at square one again. If we're talking about somebody who hasn't been mentioned yet, this is basically time to start drafting members, right? Are you comfortable with somebody who doesn't even want the job being pulled into this mess?
Well, guess what? If you're a member of Congress and you're a part of our conference, I don't care what your desires are, you need to be willing to serve. And we've got some very competent people. To be honest, there's a few people I probably wouldn't see in that speaker's office. But
when are you going to run,
for the
Congressman?
most part, hey, I thought we were friends. So why are you wanting to do that to me and my family? Yeah, but in all seriousness, that's the challenge that we have. It's become so divisive, not only internally but externally as well. And this is something that's very hard. I talked to somebody who had a number of people trying to draft this person. And he was asking me my opinion on whether he should run and throw his hat in the name, his name in the hat this time around. And my advice to him was, you better make sure that your family can handle this first because of what that means.
What about Bill Huizenga?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. My name has not come up at all, but I guess I will have to take my own advice, which is if the conference comes knocking, we all have to be willing to serve in whatever capacity they decide. I know Patrick McHenry, whose name has been thrown around. He doesn't want to do this, but he has also said if it comes to that, again, we all have to be willing to move this ahead because there's too many things happening, whether it's in Israel, whether it's the southern border, whether it's inflation. We've got to get the House back in order and back on track.
Well, you mentioned Patrick McHenry, and just earlier today, 4 Democratic members of the House of Representatives wrote a letter basically saying they would support extended powers for the Speaker pro tem in order to address some of those very issues, Congressman, you were just referring to. This includes Representatives Gottheimer, Case, Lee, and Golden. Do you think that might be necessary?
I know all those gentlemen well. I don't think it's going to be necessary, and I don't think it's a direction that Patrick McHenry, who actually is the chair of my Financial Services Committee, I know Patrick very well. I don't see him wanting to go in that direction. I think this is something that we need to handle internally, if at all possible.
Once you do get a speaker, Congressman, I know that you'll be trying to move on the No U.S. Financing for Iran Act, which you just introduced this week. As we prepare for a ground invasion in Gaza, you're looking to cut off Iran entirely from U.S. markets here. Are you comfortable if the price means $4 or $5 a gallon for gas?
Well, here's the thing. The backsliding that has occurred that's allowed Russia and Iran to expand their oil exploration hasn't helped us with that fuel oil price already. So here's what we need to do is spur the domestic production along. That's what this administration needs to do. We have an answer here. It's domestic energy, and we have more of it than we ever even imagined we had. And we have to allow it to be explored and utilized and tapped. This administration is standing in the way of that. I think the American people need to send that message to this administration, too.
Congressman, I'm glad you could join us here. I guess we'll see you when you get back in town. Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga of Michigan, thanks for the time on another busy day in Washington. Joining us now around the table, Bloomberg's Megan Scully and Gregory Cordy as we continue the conversation here on a Get Out of Town Friday. Good to see you guys here. Megan, what do you think? You lead our congressional coverage here in the Bloomberg Bureau. You just heard directly from a Republican who was in the conference. No one is near 217. Are we talking about this a week from now today?
Yes, I think that is quite possible. What has been so astonishing to me throughout this process is how Congressman Huizenga is not the first person to say this. Mm-hmm. There have been multiple. Your rank and file, your typical loyal soldiers within the party have said time and again over the last several days, we don't know if anyone can get to 217. And earlier this week, or just yesterday, in fact, my sense of time is totally warped now, but, we had the leaders of 2 national security committees saying, look, we need to maybe think about making a deal with Democrats here on something so we can at least move Israel aid and keep the government open.
Yeah, and of course, we're going to have to wait and see if a week from now Jim Jordan has been able to secure the votes he needs. But an issue for at least some that has been expressed is his closeness, perhaps, to former President Trump and the events on January 6th, including former Congresswoman Liz Cheney, who tweeted this or posted on X today. Jim Jordan was involved in Trump's conspiracy to steal the election and seize power. Goes on to say if ours nominate Jordan to be Speaker, they will be abandoning the Constitution. Gregory, my question is, does it matter what Liz Cheney thinks, or if that is even true?
Well, remember Liz Cheney, after chairing the 9/11 committee, co-chairing it, and making this case to the American people, lost her seat in a primary in Wyoming, and it's really sort of been, since then, I think it's fair to say, somewhat of a pariah even within the Republican Party. I don't think her opposition to the Jordan speakership counts much at all in that caucus.
Do you think it resonates, that idea of his proximity to January 6th?
Oh, I think absolutely that if we want to broaden this out to 2024 in presidential politics, we're going to have President Joe Biden running on this issue of democracy. And this is yet another way for Biden to create a contrast with House Republicans if they are led by Jim Jordan, a guy who denied that Biden even won the last election. Yeah, that's going to put those issues of democracy and vote counting back into the frame in 2024.
Megan,
if I
please do.
Just add on to that for a second. I think we saw that play out today. Just an hour before they took the ballot, Representative Austin Scott from rural Virginia, very not well known outside of Congress. And Kaylee, you were outside of his office, and his next door neighbor in Longworth didn't even know that he was running. Came as a shock to all of us. And he still walked out with like 80 votes.
80 protest votes, right?
80 protest votes. Yeah. But what's notable about Austin Scott is he's extremely conservative, but he voted to certify the election on January 6th.
This is really something. So when we come back next week, it's anyone's guess if there will be a floor vote. And Jim Jordan's got some serious work to do this weekend.
He absolutely does. But of course, also this weekend, Gregory, we could see the start of a ground invasion in Gaza on the part of Israel. That is widely expected. And I just wonder if that amps up the political pressure for Congress to be in a functioning place come next week.
It's certainly difficult for Republican members of the House of Representatives to complain that President Biden isn't doing enough to help to Israel to defend itself against terrorist attacks if they are not willing to come in, rally around a speaker, and produce even something as simple as a resolution condemning Hamas on the floor of the House. I do think that's in the back of the minds of a lot of Republican members who want to get this drama over as quickly as possible, but obviously they have not yet been able to figure out the path to do that yet.
All right, and we'll see when they can do so. We're all keeping an eye on our clocks, but at least this weekend, Joe, everybody's off the hook, it seems. Thank you very much to Bloomberg's Megan Scully and Gregory Cordu. We appreciate your time. We want to add another voice to the conversation. Joining us now is Libby Cantrill, head of U.S. Public Policy and managing director at Pimco. Libby, we always come to you for the view on how financial markets are or should be viewing what is happening here in Washington. We could be looking at 2 full weeks or more of a not functioning House of Representatives. When do the markets need to start to care in a more material way?
Yeah, Kaylee, well, good afternoon. I mean, clearly the markets have been distracted by the other events happening, including, of course, the war in the Middle East, as well as rising treasury rates and lots of focus on government deficits as well. So, as of right now, folks are sort of seeing through the noise a bit, not really paying attention to what's happening in Washington. However, and you bring up a very good point in the conversation before, we have not actually seen the House of Representatives without a speaker for this long since 1971. And you're right to call it into question. This is a pretty acute time right now. There's, of course, $3 billion in the coffers to Israel every year. That was legislated several years ago. That's a sort of an annual appropriation. But that will run out and likely quite quickly. So that will probably, and we would expect that would bring some urgency to this situation. I think a lot of us thought that the invasion last week, the events of last weekend, would have sort of created some sort of sense of urgency among House Republicans, but that clearly is not the case. So I think the bottom line here is there is likely going to be kind of more iterations, more twists and turns. I would agree. I think Representative Jordan is going to be hard pressed to find those votes among those moderate Republicans. So we might see this for several more days. But again, I think that when push comes to shove, there will be a Speaker of the House, and they will likely be forced to get some sort of Israeli aid and likely some Ukrainian aid added to that as well.
Well, let's talk about some of these twists and turns, Libby. We always curl up with your note to clients when it arrives, and you mentioned a name in there that I just keep coming back to. He spoke in the room today to tell everybody to go home and do their homework. That was Kevin McCarthy. He's still the only person who's ever gotten to 217, or in his case last January, 218. You write in your note, though, that take with a grain of salt this idea. Recent polling bears out 75% of Americans find McCarthy ineffective. 60% supported his removal. Those were CBS numbers, making, to your point, his comeback even more improbable. But everything's improbable in this conversation right now. Could we get to the end of next week and Kevin McCarthy sitting in the back of the chamber saying, "Miss me yet"?
You know, I think that is very unlikely. Now, never say never, and you're right that this has all been, relatively unpredictable. But those, 8 folks, those 8 Republicans who voted against McCarthy, who, of course, brought up the motion to vacate to begin with, they have been steadfast in their resolve that their opposition to former Speaker McCarthy still stands. Honestly, I think maybe even a more likely scenario than sort of the comeback kid, as I characterize it in my note, could be, and again, I think this is also unlikely, but could be more of a coalition candidate. There is, of course, there are Democrats that a Republican speaker could get. There would probably have to be some compromises, and that likely would, not kind of pass the smell test among most Republicans. But I almost think that's more likely, still remote, but more likely than a comeback for Speaker McCarthy.
Libby, it's like you're reading our minds, because Democrats right now are having a press conference outside the Capitol. Hakeem Jeffries was just speaking, and he was outlining, you're seeing Catherine Clark now, but he said there's really 2 paths forward. On the one hand, House Republicans can triple down on extremism, or on the other hand, traditional Republicans can break away and partner with Dems on a bipartisan path forward. Libby, do you have a time frame in mind on when that actually might become more likely, how much pain Republicans may be willing to tolerate before some of them might actually consider jumping?
Yeah, again, I think the possibility of this is very remote, just maybe a little bit less remote than Speaker McCarthy coming back. And the vast majority of the Republican caucus is going to find this sort of anathema to them to elect, to sort of work with Democrats and elect a coalition speaker. And so I think they are going to try to exhaust all alternatives before they really get to that point. I just think that, again, just in terms of sort of scenario analysis, that is slightly more likely than a return of Speaker McCarthy. And I think, Kayleigh, the reason why I'm reluctant to sort of put even, more than, say, 10% odds on this is because really the Democrats are going to exact a price. They are not going to do this for free. They are going to, really require some sort of quid pro quo. And that likely will be sort of a bridge too far for the majority of Republicans. So I think that is very unlikely. But you're right. I mean, maybe they do exhaust every alternative, and then at some point they come together and work with the Democrats. It just seems unlikely at this point, just given all of the water that's been under the bridge so far.
I want to bring everybody back, Libby, to a conversation we had in the throes of the debt ceiling debate, when you said the real deadline on a potential shutdown was the end of the year. This is as they were crafting, at that time, what appeared to be a budget deal that's since been relitigated and helped us get to this point now. But, of course, November 17 is the next stop on the road here for a potential government shutdown. If we get back to that point, you were saying months ago that the end of the year is really the deadline that we should be looking at, when a 1% across-the-board cut would be put in place following the elements of that debt ceiling deal. Is that where you are now? We somehow get through November 17th, and we're going to be talking about a shutdown around the holidays.
Yeah, and I think actually to Kayleigh's first question, just about when markets are going to take notice, markets will start getting more jittery as we get closer to that November 17th deadline. You'll remember that this government funding deal that Speaker McCarthy fastened, that then, of course, caused him to lose his speakership, really, in some ways, was just a reprieve, not a resolution, right? This sort of kicked the can down the road in sort of traditional, congressional form. So November 17th is really the big day. So I do think markets will start getting jittery as we get closer to that date without a speaker. Again, I think our view is probably they will come together and elect somebody in advance of that. But you're right that really it's December 31st. It's the end of the year. And the reason why is because, going back to that debt ceiling deal, there was this sort of 1% sequester across the board, including on defense, which, of course, many Republicans are going to want to defend if they're operating under what's called a continuing resolution. So really, that is the deadline to pass these appropriations bills. But at this point, I mean, it's going to be really, a heavy lift to get these 12 appropriations bills through both the House and the Senate. Probably will have to be conferenced at this point, just given the differences before they get signed into law. So I think, bottom line is we're looking at that deadline. But from a market's perspective, to kind of Kaylee's question in the beginning, it's really that November 17th. And I do anticipate that markets will start getting more nervous, in addition to all the other things that they're jittery about as we get closer to that date, if we're still without a speaker.
A whole new version of Schoolhouse Rock with Libby Cantrill. It's great to see you, Libby, and thank you for the insights, as always, helping talk us through this. She's the head of U.S. Public Policy, managing director at Pimco. Coming up on Bloomberg, from Israel to Taiwan, the growing number of geopolitical concerns facing the Biden administration. Now we're learning about North Korea's role in the war in Ukraine. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV. Next week, the White House will call for additional emergency aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. As the U.S. says now, North Korea delivered arms to Russia for use against Ukraine, which we told you was coming. For more on the growing geopolitical concerns for the Biden administration, we bring in Sean King, Senior Vice President at Park Strategies. Sean, thanks for being with us here. The lessons that we can learn looking at what's happening right now in Israel involving Hamas, of course, on the eve, could be the eve of a ground invasion into Gaza. What lessons can we learn from what's happening on the Korean Peninsula, or has happened?
It reminds me a lot of the books I've read about the Korean War. The way that Hamas stormed into Israel last weekend can remind one of the way North Korea surprise attacked South Korea in 1950. Plus the use of tunnels, which North Korea uses. Remember when North Korea attacked the Blue House and tried to assassinate the South Korean president decades ago? Those were tunnels under the DMZ, which I myself have visited. And as my friend Bruce Bechtel Jr. at Angelo State University has pointed out, North Korea supplies Hamas with weapons through Iran. He's actually identified specific North Korean rockets in Hamas still photos from last weekend's carnage. And the way that Hamas has tried to overwhelm Iron Dome with all these rockets, which are very rudimentary, you think North Korea is looking at that. We have the THAAD anti-missile defense shield in South Korea, other missile defense systems in the region. But they, with much better rockets, they're probably thinking, how could they overwhelm South Korea in a war situation? So I see a lot that South Korea can pay attention to from what's happening in Israel right now.
It's fascinating. And of course, you referenced the Iron Dome. The U.S. already has sent replenishments for that system, has promised to deliver whatever aid Israel needs. But there is talk of lumping it in with aid for Ukraine, also aid for Taiwan. Is there danger in trying to do all this funding at once? Should these be addressed individually?
Well, ideally, it would be great if we could look at each on the merits. But with politics being what it is today, as we enter a hyper-election cycle and without even a speaker, and the world's on fire, not waiting us to get our act together. As long as we can get the stuff through, let's do it whichever way possible. We don't live in an ideal world.
I'm compelled by your view on Korea here, as many question what China might be learning about Taiwan. Does that feel like a less imminent threat to you now?
Well, Taiwan's always been a threat for the 25 years that I've followed it. I don't really see the parallels between what's happening in Israel and what could happen in Taiwan. And people think maybe Beijing would take advantage.
Exactly. There was a lot of armchair quarterbacking.
Yeah, but if they didn't take advantage of 9/11 or the depths of the Iraq War in 2003, we're not even directly involved in this. Now, capabilities on the mainland side have increased, and intent and Xi Jinping and whatnot. We have a Taiwan election in January. But I don't think this incident alone. But I know Israel is very disappointed with Beijing's lack of a clear condemnation of the Hamas actions in the last few days.
Do you think all of this, though, and we only have about a minute left, is a result of the U.S. being seen as weaker on the global stage? How much of this is a U.S. reflection?
No, I think Hamas are bad people. Israel's the good guy, and they're going to do this sooner or later. It's not always about us. So I don't see how we're at fault for any of this. It's just bad people doing bad things.
And on that note, we will leave it. Sean King, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate your time this evening. That is Sean King, Senior Vice President of Park Strategies. Now, coming up, we'll continue the conversation around the war between Israel and Hamas with William Cohen, former Secretary of Defense and CEO of the Cohen Group. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
any country, for any group, or anyone thinking about trying to take advantage of this atrocity, to try to widen the conflict or to spill more blood, we have just one word: don't. The world is watching, and so are we. And we aren't going anywhere.
The Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin issuing a stark warning earlier today in Tel Aviv, where we saw the Secretary of State yesterday that says Palestinians flee Gaza City to the south amid mounting expectations of an Israeli ground invasion and Israel's urging of an evacuation. Former U.S. Ambassador to Iraq, James Jeffrey, weighed in on what could happen here with regard to potential civilian casualties when I spoke with him earlier today on Bloomberg Sound On.
They will adhere to the law of war, but that neither requires nor will they make it their top priority to spare civilians. If you're going to take, as Tony Blinken said, every possible precaution to avoid attacking civilians or hurting civilians, you don't invade an area where civilians are being held by the tens of thousands as essentially human shields by Hamas.
For more, we bring in William Cohen, the former Secretary of Defense and CEO of the Cohen Group. Mr. Secretary, it's good to see you and welcome back to Bloomberg. What is about to happen in Gaza?
Well, frankly, we don't know at this particular point. I think the Israelis are really on the horn of a real dilemma at this point. If they go in quickly, that reduces the chances that they'll get the hostages out. If they delay too long, then the world will turn against the Israelis and put more pressure on them to make concessions in order to stop the bloodletting that's taking place. So they have a real challenge here in terms of what is their priority. Is the priority to dismantle the leadership of Hamas, which I believe it has to be, or is it to get the hostages out first and then worry about Hamas later? I think it's the reverse. And I hate to say that. I think the families of the hostages are hoping beyond all that the Israelis, coupled with whatever assistance we can give them, can get those hostages out. And I think the Israelis are more concerned at this point that they not allow Hamas to get away with what they have done, the horrific damage they've done to the Israelis, not only militarily, but psychologically.
Mm-hmm. But, sir, it's not just about the hostages. We're talking millions of civilians, Palestinian civilians that are currently somewhat trapped in Gaza. How much collateral damage do you expect Israel will be willing to tolerate?
You know, I really don't like the phrase collateral damage. In fact, I had to use that during the time that I was in office because it means killing civilians. It means innocent people will die. And this is something that I think the Israelis have to be concerned about. I think President Biden in his passionate speech, Secretary of State Blinken in his passion as well, has said, be balanced here. We know you have to seek to eliminate Hamas, but don't, as much as possible, avoid killing thousands of innocent civilians. That not only will kill people by the thousands, but it will also undermine your status right now as having been the victim of a horrific act. So I think this is what the administration has tried to do is saying you need to go in. We understand that. You need to kill the Hamas, but you need to take care that you don't turn the sea into a bloodletting. There was the old expression, they made a desert and they called it peace. You can't make it a bloodletting and calling it peace. So the Israelis, I'm sure, are concerned about this. I think we as human beings have to be concerned about this. And we need to find a way to satisfy the Israelis being a secure, independent state. And at the same time, I think ultimately there's going to have to be a separate state for the Palestinians. I have advocated this for years. I believe there'll be no solution without it. But right now, they cannot negotiate with Hamas, which is dedicated to the erasure, to the absolute extinction of not only Israel, but Jews at large. So it's a tough problem, but ultimately the Palestinians have to be taken into account. There won't be any kind of a peace in the Middle East unless we do. Right now, we have to go after Hamas and take them out as best we can.
Just to expand on this idea of protecting civilians as a matter of humanitarian aid, as well. Secretary Cohen, we heard from Antony Blinken, who's touring the region right now in Qatar today. The Secretary of State spoke to the difficulty of getting aid to civilians in Gaza. Here's what he said.
Efforts to get humanitarian aid into Gaza are complicated by the fact that Hamas continues to use innocent civilians as human shields and is reportedly blocking roads to prevent Palestinians from moving to southern Gaza out of harm's way. We know the humanitarian situation is urgent. We're actively engaged with partners, including Qatar, to get aid to those who need it.
Secretary Cohen, I could ask you about military strategy, but I'm curious, not the view there of the State Department, but the Pentagon when it comes to this issue. When you were the Secretary of Defense, you're sitting in your office having conversations about humanitarian quarters, about creating safe zones. Is that going to be part of this plan?
I think it has to be. We cannot sit back as a world, sitting back and looking at what's about to unfold and say that we can't make every effort to find a safe corridor, safe haven for tens of thousands of Palestinians who are innocent, who are not supporters of Hamas. You cannot sit back and say, well, they're on their own. There has to be some effort and a substantial effort made to make sure that tens of thousands of innocent people do not die in this bloodbath. So it's, I think we'll call upon, as Secretary of State Blinken did today, upon the leadership of Qatar, a very important country. But there are others in the region, including Egypt, including other Arab states who have seen the benefit of having peace with Israel, whether it's UAE, whether it's Bahrain, whether it's any other country in the region. They have seen what working with Israel has produced for their own countries. And so we have to appeal to them to say, if this gets out of control, this could spread to the entire region and destabilize the world economy. So everybody has a stake in this, but especially the Israelis at this point.
Mr. Secretary, how great do you think that risk is that this turns into a wider regional conflict?
Well, you never want to try to play guessing games with how likely is it to take place. It would only take a spark. For example, I think the fuse has already been lit, but it runs all the way from Iran into Hamas, into Hezbollah, and elsewhere. And so I think that anything could happen if Hamas, if Hezbollah were to start striking Israel in the north, start overloading them with missile strikes. That could spread into Lebanon. And then what happens with the rest of the Arab countries? What do? Send their warriors in, or I should say terrorists in, to fight alongside of Hezbollah and Hamas? And so once that happens and the price of oil starts to spike anywhere from where it is today, going up $3 a barrel to up $150 a barrel, some of the projections are, that sets the entire world economy toward a recession, if not a depression. So those things can happen unless great care is taken. So I don't think we should minimize it. It's possible, but that's why prudence is required. That's why President Biden is where he is, Secretary Austin. They're urging that the Israelis have everything they need. They're also urging do it prudently and save as many innocent lives as you can.
All right, really valuable to get your insight and perspective today. Thank you very much. That's, of course, former Defense Secretary William Cohen, the Cohen Group founder, chairman, and CEO. We really appreciate your time. Now, coming up, we'll have more on the latest developments in the war between Israel and Hamas.
Make no mistake, the United States will make sure that Israel has what it needs to defend itself. And Israel has a right to protect its people.
We'll dig into the political implications for the U.S. with our panel next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
What Israel is doing is defending the lives of its people and, as I said, trying to make sure that this cannot happen again. And I think any country faced with what Israel has suffered would likely do the same thing. Imagine if this had happened in the United States.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken there responding to a question from Bloomberg's Ian Marlowe in Qatar earlier today. For more, we assemble our political panel. Jeannie Shanzano, Iona University political science professor with us in New York. Lisa Camuso-Miller, partner at Reset Public Affairs, former RNC communications director with us in Washington. Wonderful to see you both. Jeannie, talk to me about the Biden administration walking this fine line between supporting Israel, as they say today, yesterday, tomorrow, acknowledging the need for Israel to retaliate against Hamas, but also calling for the protection of civilians, not just hostages, but Palestinians who live in Gaza. How difficult will it be to straddle that line when this ground invasion begins?
You know, I think they are striking exactly the right tone, and from a policy perspective, it is exactly the right policy. You know, Joe Biden has given a full-throated support, as has the administration, and most members of Congress, we should say, to Israel. And that is the right thing to do. And at the same time, they have said we also want to try to ensure the safety and the health of all civilians in Gaza. And to your point, Joe, it is a really difficult thing to achieve. They know that, but they are doing everything they can diplomatically on the ground. I thought Secretary of State Blinken's remarks today were right on point to ensure and assure of that. And so, you know, of course, it is the utmost concern, the safety of everybody in Gaza, including the hostages, the Americans and the Israelis and the other foreign nationals that are there. And so they are trying their best to see if they can get any kind of safe passage for civilians out of there.
And of course, it isn't just about the optics and the gravity and the horror of some of the images we have seen and may have yet to see, Lisa, but it also is the fact that this is a critical U.S. ally in the Middle East, and especially the difficulty that the Biden administration is having at the moment of trying to maintain unity and support for another ally, Ukraine, in Europe. They can't really afford to not give Israel everything it needs, right?
Yeah, I mean, Jeannie gave us the long list of those that are standing up in support of Israel and doing everything they can. George W. Bush, add him to the list as well. He today also came out in favor of doing everything we can to support Israel. This was an unprovoked terrorist attack on innocent civilians, and we absolutely have to respond in a way that's appropriate to what happened.
What do you make of a concern about civilians this weekend, the call for not just evacuations, which some have said Israel is not giving enough time to Palestinians. 24 hours to move 1 million people out of Gaza City is not terribly realistic. But following a ground invasion here, it's going to be very difficult for Israel to spare the lives of civilians, to protect them. James Jeffrey, the former ambassador, told us earlier today that we have to be realistic. That's not the priority in this operation.
And I also hear that Hamas is giving false information to those refugees and folks that are there, that are civilians that are under threat, not to listen to what it is that Israel is telling them to do. So there is a lot of really unfair, this is a heartbreaking humanitarian situation, absolutely, on all sides. But also, too, I think, Joe, to your point about the worries and the concerns, not just in the region, but all across the globe. I mean, here in the U.S., I read today that reports of anti-Semitic activity have gone up almost 500% in the last week. This is a tremendous, tremendous detriment to, I mean, just everyone that's involved, but this situation is got to be resolved quickly.
Well, and we'll see how quickly it ultimately can. Of course, we heard earlier today from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who was speaking in Tel Aviv. Let's play that sound for you now, if we can.
This is no time for neutrality or for false equivalence or for excuses for the inexcusable. There is never any justification for terrorism. And that's especially true after this rampage by Hamas.
Jeannie, this notion of excusing the inexcusable, and yet to Lisa's point, there has been a certain degree of hostility we have seen this week, of the ramifications of people who are more pro-Palestine. We've seen a lot playing out in academia as well, where you live when you're not on Bloomberg TV, essentially. How do you think America moves forward from this moment?
You know, I really hope that we can use it as something of a teachable moment. You're right. I am with young people, spend most of my days with young people on college campuses. And there are a wide variety of opinions, but I do think we have to be very clear and underscore what the secretary just said in the clip you just played, which is that there never, ever is an excuse for terror and violence of the kind we have seen. And so you start there, and then you can talk about what should happen going forward and have a conversation. You know, as you mentioned, I'm in New York City. There was just a protest in Times Square, or a vigil in Times Square for the Palestinians. It was, by all accounts, peaceful. There is heightened security across the country, if not the world, as this plays out. So it is a really, really tough time, but I do think we have to be very clear in denouncing evil, and I think the president and the administration have been absolutely right on that front and have expressed their support, rightly so, and that's something we can use to teach everyone, including our young people.
All right, Jeannie, coming up, the Republican Party has nominated Representative Jim Jordan for House Speaker, but he's nowhere near getting the job. We'll be back with our political panel to discuss the likelihood of Jordan winning the gavel. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV.
House Republicans have just elected a Speaker nominee who in 16 years in this Congress hasn't passed a single bill because his focus has not been on the American people. His focus has been on peddling lies and conspiracy theories and driving division amongst the American people.
House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries speaking moments ago after Republicans nominated Jim Jordan to be the Speaker of the House. He still has a long way to go, though, to get 217 votes. Let's bring back our political panel. Jeannie Shanzano, Iona University political science professor, and Lisa Camuso-Miller, partner at Reset Public Affairs and former RNC communications director. So, Lisa, first to you. There were 55 Republicans who earlier this afternoon said they would not vote for Jim Jordan on the floor. And when you hear about what Leader Jeffries was just alluding to there, the idea of conspiracy theories, we've had the likes of Liz Cheney, the former congresswoman, raising the concern around his proximity to the events of January 6th. Is this a man who will be elected Speaker of the House? Should he be?
Kayleigh, let me add one thing to that list of foibles that he has, and that is that he was unkind to Steve Scalise, who is well-liked in the conference. And that is a disqualifier for a lot of people. I've heard a lot of really well-regarded members that are leaders that others look to for how they're going to vote, that said they will never support Jim Jordan. And that, to me, is also an indicator that this is not the final candidate that we're going to see run the Congress, in my
Not the final candidate. We've had numerous Republican lawmakers join us the last couple of days, including just today with Bill Huizenga. No one right now can get to 217. So is the name one that we haven't heard yet?
Well, if I do that.
No, listen, if not, it's going to be Jim Jordan or Steve Scalise or maybe a guy named Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah.
How about it?
It would be hard for me to understand how that could happen because those 8 that made this happen in the first place, that voted him out, are never going to vote for Kevin McCarthy. And Kevin McCarthy potentially could have had some support on the Democrat side if he hadn't used their support to get the CR done and then gone on the Sunday shows and said unkind things about the Democrats. So this is a food fight, and it continues to go on and on. But to me, unless something remarkable happens over the weekend and members are convinced to support Mr. Jordan, I would be surprised if he's ultimately the Speaker.
Well, Lisa raises the idea of something remarkable, perhaps a miracle. Jeannie, what role could Democrats play here? How hard is it to foresee something like a coalition coming together?
I think ultimately we may see that. I don't see it in the short term. And one thing I think Jim Jordan has against him is the clock. I think it would have been best for Jordan to try to get this on the floor as quickly as possible, because what he's got going for him is the support of the right-wing media sphere. They have been pushing hard for him. Donald Trump is all behind him. Constituents are calling their representatives. So the faster he gets this to the floor, the more likely he could try to push this through. But I do agree with Lisa. Tough to see him at this point getting to 217, and time always works against these things. And you know what we keep hearing? Even Mother Teresa herself couldn't get 217 at this point, so I'm not sure Jim Jordan could.
Yeah, boy, that's a good one, Jeannie. But look, Jeannie makes a good point here, Lisa. And if it's not Kevin McCarthy, is it a guy named Patrick McHenry who's holding the gavel right now? If we go through a week or more of this, wouldn't it be awfully easy to look up there to the rostrum and say, how about we make him the full-on speaker?
Don't forget, I worked for Speaker Hastert,
yes,
who was and still is famously known as the accidental speaker. So that is a scenario that very well could play out. There are a lot of people in town that would love to see Patrick McHenry be the speaker. And it will be interesting to see. There is still some questionability about how close he is to the former speaker, McCarthy. Sure. So some of those 8 may not like him for that very reason. But I don't see a coalition ever coming together. I think, if anything, Hakeem Jeffries is in the driver's seat, and there's no reason for that conference to do anything but stick together.
Wow.
You know, Joe, I hear Lisa say people in town. You know who's not going to be in town until next week? All of the members of the House of Representatives. And they have to go home, face their constituents who might turn around and look at them and say, why are you here? Don't you need a speaker?
Then they've got to do Sunday morning television.
Yep.
Everyone's going to knock that around. We'll all come back on Monday. It'll be a whole new list of names. Is that what we're in for?
Well, I guess we'll wait and see. But Sean Hannity is definitely doing quite a bit of work for Jim Jordan right now. So that could actually be the kind of thing that the constituents report into their members in a way that could swing it in his favor.
No vote before 6 p.m. Monday, right?
That's what we've heard.
That's what we have to look forward to. Many thanks to Jeannie Shanzano and Lisa Camuso-Miller for walking us into the weekend when anything could happen. Check out, to that end, the Washington Edition newsletter and, of course, on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll see you back here next week. This is Bloomberg.